Hello, from the Friends of Publius to the people in the form of students and teachers to the 8th episode of the Constitution and American Life with us, the Friends of Publius. As hopefully we all know, in our constitutional arrangement, the people are sovereign, which means that ultimate power rests with the people. But that power is delegated in a myriad of ways. We divide that power between the national government and the states. We separate that power amongst the three branches. Well, tonight we are going to be addressing the Federalist views expressed in Federalist Paper number 47 and taking a deep dive into the principle of separated and shared power. And hopefully we'll be able to spark those synapses between your ears and provoke your thoughts and views on what many identify as the fundamental principle of American constitutionalism. It is important to note that we are having this discussion on the heels of oral argument at the Supreme Court in the cases of Biden versus Nebraska and U.S. Department of Education versus Brown, which will assess the constitutionality of President Biden's administrative decision to forgive some student loans. This may become one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in our time as the court addresses the Chevron doctrine of congressional delegation of power and the newly, and I really do mean the very new doctrine of major questions doctrine, which holds that courts should not defer to agency statutory interpretations that concern questions of vast economic or political significance. There goes the entire 20th century judicial view of commerce and supremacy clause and administrative agencies. So let's start our discussion here by looking at the question, which specifically says the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced as the very definition of tyranny. Students are asked to deal with this question: how fundamental is the concept of separation of powers to the functionality of our American government? So I'd like to start with Dr. Williams here. And I'd like, Mike, if you could address this concept of the functionality of American government. I'm assuming that there is an implied positive expression of functionality. Am I right? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, let me start with this. I often tell my students, like when we're thinking about any sort of system, whether it's a political system or a social system or school system, that no system is ever broken, right? Systems are designed to give you exactly what they give you, right? You may not like what the system has given you, but then you have to go back and look at the design of it. So it's not broken, it's just working the way that it was set up for a particular purpose. And I think, the quote that sets up the functionality kind of points that out, right? If you ask students, what is the main function of the American government in terms of what the founders were thinking, it was that government should not promote tyranny, right? And in a lot of ways, the separation of powers was set up with that goal in mind. Like, let's set up a system where there cannot be an accumulation of power in any one branch. And that will make sure that the first goal of government, right, the first thing that we're afraid of, tyranny, will not happen. I think we could get into it and talk about the times in American history where that has failed. But in terms of those of us who get frustrated that the American government does not get as much done as we'd like it to, I think it goes back to the very idea of what the American government was set up to do, which was to prevent tyranny from occurring. And in that sense, I think it is positive, right? I think if as Chris likes to remind us, if Madison would have got his way, we wouldn't have had this kind of system at all. We'd have a government where the national level of that government would have been able to get a lot done and a lot quicker. But he didn't get that, right? He didn't get that. And we get a system that is set up to make sure that things don't get done quickly. And so I do think it's positive if you see that as the goal.
Chris or Tim?
I kind of
Thoughts
take a
on that?
jaded, I take a jaded view of this quote. I think there's another thing that's going on. Madison is attempting to address the anti-federalist critique that there's too much blending of powers. And that's one of the continual refrains that the anti-federalists use. Too much blending, too much blending, too much blending. So I think he's addressing a historical trend, that the British system had too much blending, but he's also addressing an immediate concern that the anti-federalists are charging. They have a certain charge against the Constitution. So the all that to say is this is a great PR piece. And again, I don't know that we should. My personal view is we shouldn't make them more than they are, because I see this as a more of immediate. I need to address an anti-federalist criticism. So, and that's the basis of this essay.
I agree with Tim definitely on that. I'm not sure I'm going to call it PR, but it's definitely it's close.
Wait, you've used the term propaganda numerous times in our discussions.
That's true. That's true.
Okay, guilty. I think also this is where we need to mention Baron de Montesquieu, because this is, the anti-federalists are saying, well, this is the oracle, right? I think Madison calls him the oracle in Fed 47, that, this is the separation of powers is what we have to have. And I think Madison goes on in 47 saying, well, yeah, but what was Montesquieu looking at? He was looking at the British system, and he didn't, that was what he saw in his eye. And you guys, you anti-federalists, are misreading Montesquieu, and Montesquieu may not be right. And this is why we have to have what we have. And again, you've heard me say this before, students and people watching this, make sure you're checking out 47 through 51. They are all written by Madison. It's kind of a package deal. He lays out the argument in 47, wraps it up in 51. But I came across, and believe it or not, I was actually preparing for tonight's episode. It may not seem like it, but I was. A quote that I had not read before in Federalist 15 by Hamilton. So I'm going to read it. So bear with me. It's pretty short. Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. So that's Hamilton in Fed 15. I think that makes me think of some of this idea that we need these constraints, if you will, in terms of these different types of power within the government to do different things, but they do need to be somewhat blended, as Madison would argue.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear, Mike, that the function of government is to not fall into tyranny, or as they said, or Madison said in Federalist 51, good government is defined in the end by justice. And to me, justice would be obviously the elimination of tyranny. Is that an accurate understanding of what you were saying?
I'll defer to definitely Tim and Chris on this, but it seems to me that what's upmost in the founder's mind, taking out of the context, this is part of a PR campaign, that there was a real fear of national government, and that you wanted to set up a government that would be curtailed to do a lot, just exactly what Chris just mentioned. So that's the context that I saw your question. Yeah,
I couldn't help but think that check and balance is maybe more important for functionality and prevention of tyranny. I mean, I know that there are some people that they don't teach these as separate constitutional principles, that separation of powers and check and balance are really one and the same, that you can't have one without the other. And so I guess this might be one of those questions that students could take exception to the premise of the question that, separation is all that in a bag of chips. Well, maybe check and balance is more important than, you have to address the question, but it might be an opportunity to say, however, Check and balance may be more important for functionality.
I'm going to agree with Mike in his original assessment that, I mean, the framers, I don't think, and again, the blanket statement for the framers, but I don't think they were more fearful of Great Britain coming back. They were more fearful within the Constitution of and that's why the Hamilton quote that I really liked, of human nature. And so that human nature must be constrained. And I think Madison in 51 talks about, you know, who are it's the people, but you have to have auxiliary precautions. And what are these auxiliary precautions? I think it's separating out the powers, or the blending, if you will, as he elaborates on. And as Tim just said, the checks and balances that go into play. I think the separation of powers and checks and balances are two separate things. They seem similar sometimes, but I think it's there to prevent a tyrannical government.
You see, I don't know if I agree with that distinction in the American context.
Separation of powers and checks and balances?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like, I mean, I was taught that really it's a separated system sharing powers, that each of the three articles talks about it talks about the limits as well, like what the role of the president in legislation and the role of the Congress in appointments. Like it's all checks and balances. There's none of the three main articles talk about any of these branches doing things in complete isolation. To get anything done, they have to rely upon the other branch. I mean, there is no judiciary without the president's appointment process, right? So I see it as a distinction without difference in the American context. And I guess that's the way I was talking about it. I'm not sure in seeing in that context, Tim, I mean, this is, and to get back to Chris's point, this really is a PR campaign, because if the anti-federalists are really fearful of this blending of powers, I guess I'm making the case that that's what we really have, is a real blending of powers. And Madison is trying to make the case that it's not, but in operation, it really is.
I think Madison is making the case that it is the blending of powers is required in our system. Yeah. I think he's going to make that argument. That,
but he also talks about, in that functionality, that each branch is going to be jealous of the other, ambition counteracting ambition there. And therefore, for it to work at I think the level Madison's talking about is that, members of Congress are going to represent that institution and battle against the other two branches and so forth and so on there. Professor Moore, I think you were going to jump in.
No. That's where I was going to go with that ambition, institutional ambition. Yeah. So
I'm wondering, Tim, given the fact pre-Constitution here, all right, and trying to explain this separation of powers, checks and balances, given the fact that the majority of the early state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation designed governments based on legislative supremacy. So that seems to be the overwhelming tradition. Yeah, there are some exceptions to that. What would you identify as the significant factor or turning point in the 1770s, 1780s to move towards a system of separated and shared power versus, again, the more common thing you see of legislative supremacy in both the articles and states?
Wow, you're asking me to identify a clean, here is the moment.
That's what I do.
Okay, I'll play. I think it's Robert Morris. Well, let me back up. I mean, sorry.
Oh, you can just leave it there, and that'll make the kids scramble for days.
Move on. No, I think. Look, I think legislative supremacy is absolutely, in a way, predictable. Because the whole Revolutionary era, there's great suspicion about the legislature being corrupted in the British system. The legislature being corrupted by the king's, overly influenced by the king's ministers, the king and council. So I think there's, in some regards, the legislative supremacy can be seen in part as a tweak on we want to keep a clean separation from the executive and our experience with the king's ministers. Now, when you get to the Articles era, I think the Articles had, okay, there was a legislature and it was supreme, okay, yada yada yada, but they had executive committees that Congress set up. At any given time, I think there were like 5 or 6 executive committees, and they basically ran because most of the time Congress can't even make a quorum, so they delegated, which may come up later. The Articles Congress delegated responsibility to these executive committees and put people in charge of these executive committees and gave them a lot of power. And now we're back to Robert Morris. He's the guy that's basically in charge of the economy. And he's basically running the economy, and he's not even a member of Articles Congress. And he's always whining, and he's threatening to resign, do it my way, or I quit. And, you know, he constantly, and he's a pain in the ass, but he's really good at running the economy. But, and so I think this legislative supremacy in the Articles has to be tempered a little bit, because there are a separation or a delegation of powers even under the Articles of Confederation. So to your point, is there this critical moment? Well, yeah, he eventually quits and they accept his resignation. And I think in some part you could make the argument that what we have in the Constitution is an adjustment of these executive committees. And now we have an executive in the Constitution. So I think there is something to this notion that the Articles, the way they functioned extra constitutionally, I would say, kind of paves this way for a tempering of legislative supremacy.
So it sounds.
Well, how much? Go ahead, Chris.
I just want to throw this in there. So is that the actual origination of the administrative state?
I believe you can make the argument that, well, I don't know. I mean, David, were you going to ask about this kind of question? I mean, I know you're well enough to know that you're probably going to ask this kind of question.
Yeah, we're going to go down the 20th century. I guess what I'm wondering, and now, gosh darn it, I forgot what I was going to follow up on there. It'll come to me sometime at 2 a.m. and this next morning here. Chris, the short answer is I believe so. Yes.
Okay.
Well, so is there any truth to the notion that Massachusetts, its structure, has a tremendous influence?
Absolutely, and so does Pennsylvania. I mean, Massachusetts is the positive influence story, and Pennsylvania is the negative influence story. Like, if you want to make the argument that the influence of how wonderful balanced that the Massachusetts with a strong governor, that has this influence on the Constitution, and I think that's a valid view. But you also have to think about what they're against, and they don't want Pennsylvania. They don't want a kind of an executive-less Constitution like Pennsylvania has, and constant turnover in elections too. That's another feature. So I think there's a positive influence, to your point, David, Massachusetts, but there's this negative role that Pennsylvania plays, and we want to avoid that.
Does that make John Adams the grandfather of the Constitution? I mean, I know he can't be the father since he's not there.
Yeah.
But Madison gets all this credit, and it seems to me that maybe Adams has been, short-shifted here on this.
Well, let's start a petition and get a national holiday or something going.
Yeah,
I mean, it could be good for like short, fat guys. I got a chance.
That's true. Well, you're not alone there, my friend. Not alone there. So, Professor Kavanaugh, political parties is always a very difficult area for me to get my hands around here. But when I look at this question, it seems to emphasize that the emergence of these parties plays a more than significant role in the functionality of separation of parties. And I've come to the belief that political parties themselves have little impact, in the sense that they were anticipated within the system. That in the end they are factions, and the system was designed to deal with factions. Are you with me on that, or do you take a different approach to the role of parties?
I'm going to take a little bit different approach. Bob Diane is a political scientist professor at the University of Evansville in Indiana, and he said this, and it made sense, that political parties in themselves are not necessarily factions, but you have factions within political parties. That may not hold true for both parties these days, because there are certainly purity tests. I think the system, though, was designed in terms of separation of powers to what, I would agree, David, that there's an anticipation of political parties, and we have them from the jump, honestly. Even after the Constitution is ratified under the Washington administration, you have Jefferson who's resigning because he realizes that, he's opposed to some of the stuff that's going on, and he has a better chance outside of the administration than inside of the administration to institute the changes that he would like to see. I do think that I don't think this system itself, and Mike was alluding to systems earlier, I don't think this system itself is strong enough or was anticipatory enough to think of where we would be with modern political parties, where we are right now in 2023. I don't think the system is strong enough. I don't know if that's the right word.
Don't parties in the end, it takes a while for them to emerge into somewhat of a role that they play in today's world. But it seems to me they do undermine the arguments that Madison makes in 51, in that they end up shifting alliance from the institution, which he talks about in Federalist 51, that the loyalty and the defense of the institution is what's going to make it work, to now the loyalty is to party, and therefore that can and does have a pretty significant effect on how the system will play out.
I absolutely agree with, and I've used this line numerous times, I think, from Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, that we have members in a separation of powers government acting as if they're in a parliamentary system, and they're not. And Tim, I think, alluded to this just a few minutes ago, that these, and you did too, David, that these jealousies among branches, that they're going to give these powers to protect themselves from the encroachments from other branches. But we don't see that as much anymore. I think it's interesting to note too, when you have a one party, and it shouldn't be surprising, I suppose, but when you have a one party dominance, the government seems to function more quickly. You think of Wilson in the progressive era. You think of FDR and his New Deal. And it's interesting, if you think about the resistance that President Kennedy had to some of his programs with the Republican Congress, but after his assassination and the sympathy invoked by that assassination, as well as the Democratic landslide in 64, and Johnson's, being Johnson, you think these time periods where there was a dominant party, the government seemed to function more fluidly. I'm not going to put a normative assessment on how well the legislation that came out of these periods, but in these time periods where you have a dominant party within the Congress as well as the presidency, and they're simpatico, you tend to have a government that functions very quickly and responsively.
Well, and doesn't that seem to contradict the political science perspective that divided government is in many ways more functional, I guess, if we go back to the question, and more effective than unified government?
Well, I would go back to Mike's point from the very beginning. It was functional in the fact that it prevented tyranny. I think that was Mike. Wasn't that your point from the jump? That the idea that the separation of powers was there, whether it be at the national level, or, separating powers out one way and separating out powers another way, was there to prevent tyranny. So I would say it was very functional in that regard.
I'm shocked, Chris. I really am, because I guess I've always kind of assumed that the role of political parties does have an impact on functionality. The Federalists continue their influence in the Marshall Court for many years. The conservative Republican Party now, this is where I thought you would go. I think the Republican Party and the conservative Republican Party has had a tremendous influence on the court. And I think we see that in the decisions they're making. I think so. I'm kind of surprised. I'm kind of surprised that you're not strident on the role of political parties and their impact on the branches. I guess I do see some of that as operating.
Yeah, well, I think if you're to nail me down, like right now, what time and date, it's 2023, I would probably more vociferous in my frustration with some political parties. But I think historically, trying to get kids to think big picture through the course of history.
Yeah. Okay.
I just want to raise this. This is I'm thinking through this as I'm saying it, but this notion of
like that's unusual.
Yeah, no. This notion that the institutions, like there's going to be this identity with institutions, and that was going to keep the system like in equilibrium. Most of the current political science research on members of Congress, of which I'm familiar with, the premise of every single article is the first goal of every member of Congress is to get reelected. Period. And there's some political scientists who see that as like a truth that has been true 250 years ago as it was today. So whether there's political parties or not, right, people want to get reelected. Now, to the extent that political parties can help that, then you use them, right? They recruit, they give you money. I think there's an argument today that political parties don't have enough power over their members. Yeah. Especially for the Republican Party today. Look what happened with the speaker vote. What is the Republican Party? And so I think it ebbs and flows. And I think it has to do with, at certain times, members have seen parties as beneficial to them getting elected. So there's more of a connection with them. And sometimes it's not. I don't think most members of Congress have ever honestly said that they have an allegiance to a branch. I just wonder how much of that argument is actually rooted in any empirical finding that a member would say that they have an allegiance to a branch, or how much of that is just part of, part of a mythology.
I think in the Senate, you're going to see, far more allegiance to the Senate, at least historically. There, you may be right about the House, except for maybe House leadership or something like that. Historically, contemporarily, I agree with you. It's parties have shattered that, and its loyalty to the party, and that kind of brings this to the forefront, Mike, as far as this role of parties. You think about it, in our lifetime, we had government shutdowns under Clinton, Obama, and Trump, and it looks like we're heading towards another potential government shutdown in a few months. I'm just curious, does this reflect a positive or a negative impact of political parties on our system of separated powers? Is that a good thing for us that they shut it down because that's stopping tyranny?
Well, that's a separate question.
Darn.
The first one, I'm going to build on Chris's argument in that I don't know if political parties have anything to do with the government shutting down or not. There's been political parties in the system since the beginning. So there was a possibility for shutdown from the beginning. I think there's more context. I think you're absolutely right. Who did you start with? Clinton. And what does Clinton represent? The first time we've had a government in place after the end of the Cold War. I really think that larger political context, that what our politicians are thinking and what they're willing to fight about is different after the Cold War ends. And I think that it's more complicated than just political parties. I think there's way more going on in terms of what's causing each of those shutdowns. And each of those shutdowns are preceded by a period of time where Congress was super active. I mean, the Congress before the 112th, right? The 111th was one of the most, some people were comparing it to an LBJ type of situation in terms of what Obama and the Congress got able to do. So I don't know. I don't see the role of parties as being as important as other things going on. But
that whole government shutdown was driven by Newt Gingrich as the leader of the Republican Party.
Mike, I'm going to push back a little bit. I disagree, because if you think of Senator McConnell, the leader of the Republicans, and even under Obama, he said his goal was to make sure that Obama was a one-term president, and that was all based on party allegiance. I'm listening to you describe that, Mike, and I'm thinking, geez, this really was a PR piece for Madison, because he totally misread human nature. Or this is one big snow job to assuage some anti-federalist fears.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't like it, political parties is not the causal factor there. Like, it's right. I mean, if there's been political parties around, why don't we see a government shutdown every single term? Why does it just happen in certain time periods? I think it has to do with leadership. It has to do with what the voters are saying they want. It has to do with, I don't know. I just don't see, parties are part of it, but they're not the cause of it.
So let me ask you,
would it make a difference if we made Congress totally in charge of creating the budget? Would that change? And then the second question would then would parties show up really prominently if Congress totally controlled the creation of the budget? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but
well, when's the last time we actually had a budget?
Yeah, like forever ago, right?
I don't know. I just think, members engage in blame avoidance and credit claiming. And I think the shutdowns are more part of that dynamic than anything parties.
So, Mike, let me ask you a question here, because based on what you just said a second ago. So do you believe that parties are responsive to their voters, their constituents, or do you believe that parties are shaping what their constituents think they want? I know it's kind of a chicken and egg kind of thing, but
I think it depends. I think in the times of the shutdowns, they're responding to what the most vocal part of their parties are saying they want.
Okay. All right.
I mean, I think in the case of Newt Gingrich, it's taking the lead from Rush Limbaugh is what's happening. I mean, it's yeah.
Okay, so I'm kind of befuddled here, Professor Williams, because that's an interesting take about the role of parties and shutdowns. Part of it is that the budget process, the rules and the mechanisms changed over time there. And also the use of the budget as almost a kind of a nuclear device politically became, somewhat accepted. But I partially agree with you, but I look at the Clinton and Obama years. These were specifically party driven, they weren't institutional. They were party driven. All right, in the sense that the leaders of the party, the Republican Party, both in 94 and 2000, and help me out there. What year was it under Obama that it got shut? Was it 2008?
No, 2012, I think it
It was
was.
2012 or so, kind of stuff. So I appreciate your perspective. I just see it as, those are examples of the system breaking down. And it's one of the things that Ornstein and Mann reference as evidence of the sickness, of our system and the role that parties have played, specifically in Congress there. So, Professor Moore, and I know I throw these things at you guys, but given your 18th century understanding of founding principles, does Congress have the authority, in your opinion? And you've kind of touched on it when you talked about the articles, and that is, do you think Congress has the authority to delegate power to the executive branch? All right, and by doing so, are they still staying within the framework and the parameters of our system of separated and shared power?
Well, again, what's on paper? Yeah, I guess I did already allude to this. Under the articles, they did it all the time, and frankly, it's a matter of convenience. And I would make the argument, it really came to fore, as I remember my 20th century studies. It comes to the fore in the one case in Schechter, I think it was. Can Congress delegate the president this control over the economy? That court, a conservative court, said no, and then eventually there's all kinds of delegation that happens after the Depression, and the whole administrative state is built upon the principle of efficiency or convenience. I mean, honestly, I guess constitutional principles, okay. I'm more interested in how the system operates, even in spite of or in addition to what's on the paper. So the fact is that we've had delegation from the very beginning, and it's always been controversial, especially if you believe in strict separation. But the reality is, I don't want my average congressman being in charge of fairly sophisticated technical issues. I want an administrative agency to take care of that. So out of sheer expertise or efficiency, I don't want Congress doing certain things. So I guess I'm comfortable with delegation doctrine as a matter of efficiency and practicality. Well, I think Congress is wise to delegate.
It's also of necessity, right? I mean, if we go back to the explosion, it's, and again, this may be a misreading or a misunderstanding, but the way I remember it is Congress and the New Deal is passing all these laws to address the economic crisis. Right. And FDR is going, my administration is pretty small. I'm going to need some help doing this.
Right.
And, and Congress says, okay, well, we'll create agencies to carry out our will. And since it's your job to enforce that and make sure that happens, we're going to do that. So it seems it's a necessity that administrative agencies are created and have, some flexibility.
Sure.
With congressional.
I don't want my congressman running the Fed.
Well, especially in right. Well, and Chris, I want to bring you and Mike into this major questions doctrine. I mean, what it seems, and again, I just learned that this really doesn't become a firm doctrine until 2017. Yeah, you have some precedents there that alludes to it, but as far as vernacular of the constitutional legal world, it's 2017 that they come up with this. And I think, oh my God, what's that going to do to the legislative process? Because what it's going to require is for Congress to get into such degrees of minutia to describe every circumstance in which that agency can act and how they can act. Is that your understanding, Professor Kavanaugh?
Yes, and I think this is talking about making something out of whole cloth. Holy smokes!
You mean this is judicial activism?
It ranks right up there with originalism. in terms of making crap up so we can interpret it how we want to. So yeah, I said that, students. Sorry.
Well, I mean, but the court wasn't real successful with their political question doctrine. So I think,
yeah. Let's go back to our boy Hugo Black. No law means
Yeah.
no law until it doesn't.
yeah, I wish you luck with that major questions doctrine.
Yeah.
Well, and it seems to me what I found fascinating in some of the research I did is Scalia was opposed to this idea. He said, really, you're going to ask Congress to delineate what is a, he goes, how can you delineate between a major question? Okay, here are major questions, and these are all ho-hum. So for one of those rare times in my life, I'm thinking, thank God for Scalia and his intellect there, that just the practical application of this doctrine. Now we know what the intent is to destroy the administrative state and to stop, the delegation of congressional, power to the executive branch. Is that how you guys understand it? That this is a nefarious motive here?
I'm not sure I would use the word nefarious, but it may work. I do believe that this is the way for people of a certain bent to be able to control the administrative agencies, because the administrative agencies aren't doing something that they don't like, or I might say doing something that their major funders don't like. The people that are funding these politicians.
I say nefarious, Chris, because to me the end game is to destroy the administrative state. Is to remove as many, the effectiveness or the, what's the word I'm looking, even the ability of these agencies to act, to remove that. And I'm thinking about what will our country look like? How will it function? Getting to functionality, if we don't have administrative agencies, and we know Congress isn't going to rise up to the level of
legislation. David, I think if you paid attention to some of the stuff that was coming out of CPAC this weekend, there are a group of people that would love to defund numerous agencies and important agencies that perform major functions for our nation, but they would like to defund those because somehow they see these as a barrier to liberty or freedom, I suppose, which is scary. I go back to Tim's point of not wanting Congress people to be in the business of trying to figure this stuff out, because I'm not sure that they have the wherewithal to make heads or tails of some of these issues that are very important, that require an expertise that they don't have.
Professor Williams, thoughts, insights on this delegation, non-delegation?
Well, I mean, it's just consistent with how you answer the question, what's the role of government? And if you see the role of government, it's going to be super narrow, and that all that will come out of government doing more is just tyranny, right? I mean, maybe it isn't nefarious. I see it as it's consistent with a certain way of viewing the purpose of the American government. And this is just another way to get at that. And to answer your question, Dave, I mean, it's going to be, on another issue, like the politics around abortion is going to be it's going to get way more interesting now that we are living in a world where abortion has become harder to get, right? It's unconstitutional. Living in a world where trains can tip over and you can have more Palestinians, and because you don't have regulations in place, because you're cutting back on the ability, like I imagine there's going to come a point where citizens are going to demand more from their members of Congress to start regulating things.
Mike, I'm going to push back a little bit, because I mean, abortions now are back to the state level, right? So it's not necessarily that abortions are necessarily unconstitutional. Now it's up to the states to decide, which makes me think of Reagan and his great line, the great lie that I'm here from the federal government, I'm here to help. So I think you see this new federalism, that there are people today who would love to push this power back to the states, and I think that's what we got with the Dobbs decision.
Well, the irony on the Ohio situation is that those who want to eliminate, defund the administrative state are angry at the national government for not doing more.
Sure.
Which again just boggles the mind of where are you on this whole thing. And then again, at least three of us, there was, I think, a general consensus across party lines in the 60s and early 70s about there were certain things that the national government, we look under Nixon, all right? I think, Tim and Chris, and you'll remember our good friend Bob Womack used to argue that Nixon was the most liberal president of the 20th century with the creation of these agencies and federal oversight. Yeah, Tim?
Well, I think your point about consensus across party lines, I mean, I look at the progressive era, and there was a lot of folks that were just fed up with railroads running roughshod over people's lives. And eventually across party lines, there was a consensus that we needed, I forget the agency that was created, but it regulated
interstate commerce.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this seems to be knee-jerk, and your point's great that the very people that are mad in Ohio right now don't want regulation. Well, this is Mike's point of what does government do? I mean, if the progressive era saw a world that was very complicated, that needed agency expertise to be a part of running the world or running the government or running the country, is it any less valid now? It's Mike's point. How much do we want, and how much do we need? Really, sit back. Do you really want to deregulate railroad codes? Come on, ask the folks in Ohio.
And we'll put into the resources that this morning on the Daily and the podcast was talking about how on this issue, Democrats and Republicans are coming together to craft a piece of legislation that would get at this type of railroad situation. So, I mean, it's a little narrower than some Democrats would like, but I think it speaks to responding. I mean, that's where the politics is going to go, because I think you're right, David. This doctrine is going to it's going to grind the system to a halt even more so than it is now. And people are going to start to feel that in their everyday lives. They're in ways they don't now.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, and I think this is actually a very good question of what is the impact on separation of powers, and I want to check the question specifically here. Let's use an illustration. Let's look at immigration here. Does the fact that Congress has failed to act for at least 3 decades on immigration and come up with some kind of national immigration plan, has the impact of that, or has the effect of that been to increase the power of the judiciary? And that is it kind of a zero-sum game that if one branch decreases, another branch has to increase?
Well, I think to quote a friend of the program, Dr. David Adler, who's in one of his articles, he said, nature abhors a vacuum. And so if you have a power that's not being used, and you're right, David, Article 1, Section 4, Congress has the power to deal with immigration and naturalization, and they're not using it, they look to the president. And the president then is, carrying out the policy based upon the directive given to him by Congress, which hasn't been much of a directive in a long time, as you alluded to. And then what you end up with are challenges to how the president carries this out because Congress is not doing its job. And that absolutely puts the court in a very powerful position in terms of
state actors. Is a part of this nature of abhors a vacuum. You'll have the state of Texas doing stuff, state of Arizona doing its own thing. Yeah.
Well, and that's what, it seems to me that the proper response, and maybe this is Pollyannish, but the proper response is for presidents to use their megaphone, their bully pulpit, to point the massive finger at Congress rather than it landing in the Oval Office, which it seems that it clearly has, all right, for numerous presidents, they should be screaming bloody murder and letting the American people know you need to get Congress on this. Don't be looking at the Oval Office because I don't have the power here. Instead, what they've done is they've assumed certain powers through the executive branch and the use of executive orders, which has gotten us into what I consider this judicial quandary.
That is, I agree with you. It is Pollyannish because what president, regardless of party, is going to say, well, gee, Congress, you've given me too much power. Here, please take some of it back.
Obama tried to do that with foreign policy and the authorization for military force.
I know he asked for something that would give him the authority, and they didn't give it to him. And what did he do? He did what he wanted to anyway. Right. And the whole idea of immigration with President Obama, prosecutorial discretion. So you're giving me these guidelines. I'm going to carry out the law as I see fit. And I'm going to go after these people, but I'm not going to go after the dreamers. So and then people lose their minds over that. So it would be fantastic if we had a president say, listen, Congress, you do this. This is your task according to the Constitution, going back to this idea of first principles. Constitutional principles, but I don't know that we would have very many people who say, Congress, this is your authority. You need to do this and you need to act. Because, I've alluded to this before. During the 2016 campaign, they had the commander-in-chief forum between then candidate Trump and then candidate Clinton. And myself and my students were beside ourselves because, Article 2, Section 2, Commander-in-Chief, when called into service, and who does the calling? Congress does the calling. So where is Congress in this discussion? But, the American public, they think the president's like the Wizard of Oz and he's got something in that black bag for everybody.
Mike, any thoughts about, I just want to check. So Chris, to the initial question, you'd say, yeah, it's just the natural order of things that if one branch doesn't fulfill, it's going to be, that vacuum is going to be filled by one of the two of the other branches or both of them. Absolutely. And again, this is really where we are right now, has put a lot of power within the court.
I agree with that. I would just qualify it by only if the politics looks good. Because it seems to me like the politics around immigration, that was good politics for Obama, right? You do something, if Congress doesn't act, then you blame Congress. If they try to take it away, you blame the courts. Same thing with the student loans. It's good politics for Biden to do it. No matter how it turns out, it's been good politics. But let's think about food stamps just ended, right? SNAP just ended for 40 million people. And Congress needed to act to keep that going. Has President Biden stepped up to make an executive action to do anything with that program? And will he? Well, he's not, because it's the politics there is not going to be as, so I agree that power abhors a vacuum most of the time, but the politics also has to work right. And there are a lot of things that no one acts upon because it doesn't fit into the calculation of whether you get reelected or not, I guess. So that's the comment.
For the students, stay tuned to see how Social Security and Medicare work out.
Right.
Right. Well, like I said, in a few months, we're going to be facing some very interesting politics. So we've kind of come to the end here, ladies and gentlemen. And as again, it's tradition, I want to go around to the FOPs and get their final thoughts, insights, and recommendations on how you might want to think about this question of separated and shared power. Professor Williams.
Yeah, I want to clarify, I guess. Obviously political parties are important. I don't want to be stuck with that beneath my name. But the point I think to think about is that political parties, like any institution, can be used in different ways by different leaders. And so I think political parties will act differently in different times depending on who's driving the wheel and how it's being done. So I think that definitely political parties have an important role in our separated system, but that role has changed depending on who's been leading them. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, there's a part on the scoring rubric. There's this thing called understanding. I'm going to suggest that you ignore check and balance to your peril on this. Another way to say this is, look, if you can, in your presentations that you're going to be doing, and you're talking about, the question is directly about separation of powers. Well, look, I think every time that you're, especially in follow-up, when you're talking about separation of powers, somebody on your panel should bring in, and here's this principle of check and balance. That judges will hear that and they'll say, these kids have thought more broadly about this question than just separation of powers. They're thinking about checks and balances, and I think that goes directly to that part of the rubric of understanding. So don't ignore check and balance in this question.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Again, Madison, as I alluded to, Madison's auxiliary precautions include both of these, separation of powers and checks and balance. I think Tim makes a great point with that. For the students grappling with this, I'm going to think, how do you define functionality?
Yeah.
That becomes a difficult thing. And this is something that, the center and We the People curriculum doesn't necessarily want to deal with. And that's the reality of the situations, because we like to deal with these really highfalutin ideals. I'm going to say ideals, because money in politics drives the bus. And so I want to think about, especially in that first bullet that deals with political parties, consider that, if you will, wherein money drives these political ideas, and whether or not this is, as Mike, I was trying to pin Mike down on this top down or bottom up idea. I do believe in our current day and age that it is definitely top down in terms of manipulating voters, and that's maybe jaded or cynical to say, but that's where we are right now, I believe.
So if I were judging this unit in this question, I look at that second bullet, and there's plenty of examples, I think, and we alluded to some of them where Congress, because of whatever reason, gridlock or whatever, fails in its duty, that we see the executive branch fill that vacuum. And I think that there are examples as well as when the judiciary trying to fill that vacuum at times. And I think there's times where the judiciary fails to step up and Congress has maybe filled that void. What I'd be looking for, is there any time in which the executive branch has failed to perform its duties in which the other two branches rose up? Something to think about, because right now, off the top of my head, I can't think of one. I'm sure my three colleagues could, but we'll leave that up to you, students and teachers. Hopefully, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but listening to you made me think of one of the very recent court cases where the court is grappling with big tech, right? And I think it was Justice Kagan that said the 9 people on the court don't know much about what you're asking us to decide. This certainly seems like something that Congress should be grappling with. So that speaks to this very thing.
That's a great line, and she got chuckles, I know, in the court when she said that. Well, hopefully we've brought some enlightenment to the dark ages of separation of powers and checks and balances. In our next session, we're going to be looking at the concept, and I'm looking forward to this, of equality Was the idea of equality, as Justice Ginsburg said, Ruth Bader, that is, was it there from the very beginning? And so we look forward to having that discussion and seeing you soon. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye bonds.